We are here for a new appointment with Let Food Be Your Medicine. It's a, let's say so, a very important block of our broadcast where we go to talk about food-related diseases. And I do it every time with our Adriano Panzironi, who I greet welcome. And with our Dr. Christian Orlando. So I would say right away, let's go to the introductory video of this block. Let's watch it together.
According to the latest statistics, 8 out of 10 Italians suffer from stress, and in particular, 87% of women and 76% of men. The situation has worsened in recent years, partly due to the economic crisis. In fact, according to an Istat survey, 58% of respondents say that stress has increased due to economic reasons, 46% due to work problems, and also due to traffic and the political situation. This state of mind also affects sleep. In fact, about 1/3 of the population has difficulty sleeping, and daily performance is also affected by this. But this chronic stress can be attributed only to psychological aspects or to different roots, as it seems to involve virtually the entire population.
The topic of Make Food Be Your Medicine is stress, and so we are going to address it with our experts. And I immediately ask Dr. Orlando, what is stress?
So, stress can be defined as the response of an organism that is subjected to excessive physical or mental challenges. The first reaction you have is called GAS, General Adaptation Syndrome, which is what our organism puts in place. You have a first active reaction when we are subjected just as a first impact to stress, which is as a fight or flight reaction, which is what our hunter ancestors were used to when faced with danger. Then when the stress lingers, we instead have a passive reaction with immobility or depression. Stress rightly then leads to the synthesis of certain hormones. So in the active reaction, mainly adrenaline and norepinephrine are expressed, while as for the passive reaction, you then have long-term stress. You basically have the synthesis of corticosteroid hormones and then cortisol, which is called precisely the stress hormone that is synthesized at the level of the adrenal gland as a result of a stimulus from the pituitary hormone ACTH, which in turn is stimulated by the hormone of the hypothalamus, which is CRH. This stress, this cortisol, then leads to various problems, increases cardiac output, increases ventricular fibrillation, increases blood glucose as it induces hepatic gluconeogenesis, and also promotes protein catabolism, then the conversion of protein to glucose, and lowers immune defenses.
So this stress, practically precursor then to so many other pathologies, carries with it a stroll of very, very serious pathologies. I wanted to ask a curiosity, because talking about stress, the life that you lead, Mr. Panzironi, certainly is a very stressful life. And you know that you during the day are caught up in so many activities. How do you combat stress on a, let's say, even personal level? This is a curiosity, so come at the moment.
I supplement products that have the ability to reduce the production of cortisol. This obviously falls within our society's line of supplements, and it shows this supplementation to have the ability to inhibit or modulate the production of cortisol. Then obviously also a different mental approach to life or to the things that happen to you certainly can make a difference, but unfortunately today's society is forced to have this overexpression of cortisol because we still come from a lifestyle that was hunter-gatherer where cortisol acted sporadically. Obviously you had the time when, as Dr. Orlando said, there was fighting or running away from a certain danger, and therefore a whole chain of hormones, including cortisol, had to be activated just to preserve our life and therefore allow us to be more efficient at the most critical time. and also because cortisol is always the ability during the day to depress the immune system to prevent us from having excessive inflammation that can damage our tissues and our metabolism. All of this is absolutely perfect. It's totally studied precisely to perfection by nature, which, as I always say, always does things right. I have to say that, however, having changed, you must have gone from the role of hunter and gatherer to being people, citizens within homes with constant and continuous daily problems, with absolutely critical and very often conflicting human interactions, and then all the economic problems and all the various problems of the modern age induces a constant and continuous activation of this stress, which then precisely the response is the production of cortisol. So you can't get out of it unless you really change the lifestyle totally, or decide to approach, obviously, life with a totally different philosophical way, but especially with proper supplementation and nutrition. And now I guess we'll talk about that, because nutrition also plays a role in cortisol stimulation. And so changing even nutrition can really make a difference.
Mr. Panzironi, we have talked so many times about this infamous stress hormone cortisol, but then what is cortisol? We asked, and this is the video that explains it to us.
Cortisol is a steroid-type hormone that is derived from cholesterol and is produced by the adrenal glands. The production of cortisol, also called stress hormone, occurs upon stimulation of adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, secreted by the pituitary gland, which in turn is stimulated by CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, produced by the hypothalamus. Cortisol released into the bloodstream interacts with hormones such as GH, testosterone, and thyroid hormones. Cortisol production has a defined circadian cadence, that is, with peak production at 6 a.m. and a steady decrease during the day until nearly zero at night.
This is the infamous stress hormone cortisol. The video explained it to us. So at this point, I want to say this is a hormone that, being a hormone, can also be kept at bay. Like all the hormones in our body.
Our body reacts with the environment, and therefore everything that happens has hormonal responses inside. And consequently, as we were saying before, changing lifestyle but also making a different diet induces changes in this cortisol production. Because, by the way, what is found today in people of a certain age, so over 50 years old, who have been following the Mediterranean diet for a long time and live a convulsive lifestyle, results in a flattening of this graph that we saw earlier. We should have high cortisol in the morning, because that's what gives us the strength, the rise in blood sugar. And so we get up with a certain energy capacity also to face the day. Then cortisol tends to go down after lunch until it almost disappears after dinner, because obviously you have the production of melatonin. So melatonin predisposes us to sleep, and it has to turn off cortisol. Otherwise, we won't be able to sleep. That's why then one of the problems of those who have an overexpression of cortisol is insomnia. Because if there is an excess of cortisol in the blood during the night, this then leads to insomnia, but it also leads to a whole series of other problems. If we think about immune diseases, when the immune system is strong just to try to fight inflammation and whatnot, this happens more at night. When we fight the immune system also at night, then so many autoimmune diseases tend to be more present, by the way. So the cortisol in these people who have this alteration is no longer recognized by peaks and troughs, but simply by an average straight line higher than the median. And this leads to a constant and continuous production of cortisol to no longer have the peak. So you get up tired in the morning because precisely you don't have this morning start, and at night you don't sleep because the cortisol doesn't go off.
So my understanding is that as with insulin or other hormones, they are all very important to our body. The thing is to keep them in balance. So overexpression of any of these hormones can be very harmful. We right now are talking about cortisol. So let's look at what are the harms of cortisol.
Cortisol can be considered a priority hormone, so it inhibits the production of other hormones, interferes with the production of neurotransmitters, and alters metabolic functions. Specifically, cortisol is able to inhibit the production of neurotransmitters such as GABA, dopamine, and serotonin. It induces metabolic alterations such as elevated blood glucose, increased blood pressure, and increased cardiac output. Cortisol induces increased protein catabolization and interferes with thyroid hormones. Finally, cortisol interferes with immune defenses by selectively destroying the class of lymphocytes known as Th1.
So the cortisol cascade causes obviously this state of stress of our body, of our organism to create and cascade, leads to a whole series of pathologies. We described them. You want to add some other pathology that maybe wasn't described more or less. There were all those that cortisol, the overexpression of cortisol, so stress causes to our body.
Actually, cortisol is a cofactor of all pathologies because by acting on inflammation, then on the immune system, by acting on blood sugar, by acting on insulin, by acting on the thyroid, basically it's a cofactor a little bit for everything. So if certainly the pathology most related to excess cortisol is insomnia, which is a pathology, but everything else comes to cortisol, it's clear that you're going to have all the metabolic pathologies. If you have, obviously, in the woman, the Hashimoto's thyroid problem, in short, it means osteoporosis. There are so many pathologies related to the alteration of the immune system, of which causes precisely the overexpression of cortisol.
So Dr. Orlando, what can we do with nutrition to balance cortisol? Keep it under control.
Certainly with nutrition, by always going to eliminate those foods that are inflammatory to the body, so that they go to stress the body itself, because we must not imagine stress only externally, but we must imagine also an internal stress within the body due to what we eat, and therefore going to eliminate, I repeat, those foods that stress because they inflame the cells. So they also directly or indirectly induce an increased synthesis of cortisol, of expression. As we have seen, then cascading goes to deregulate all the other hormones. Let's then go and remove these inflammatory foods. As I said, let's then go and make sure that cortisol is normal expressed and not overexpressed. So we always see them, the carbohydrates that then turn the body into sugars. It's those foods that create this inflammation and then internally stress precisely our body, thus activating cortisol itself.
However, you want to add something, Mr. Panzironi.
There are two phenomena that induce the overexpression of cortisol when we eat an excess of carbohydrates. The first is that when carbohydrates activate an inflammatory response, automatically our body tends to produce cortisol to extinguish this inflammation. So it's a bit of a dog biting its own tail. The more we raise the inflammation, the more we raise cortisol if we don't block the immune stimulation. Obviously, inevitably, we can't block the demand for cortisol production by our cells. The second aspect is hypoglycemia. We think that when we eat, in short, we are able to manage our blood sugar regularly through a hormone called precisely insulin. Actually, it does so in a totally disproportionate way. So the more we eat carbohydrates, the more at the postprandial glycemic peak. We see a postprandial glycemic drop. This leads us somewhat to the classic postprandial drowsiness. What happens when we feel the need to sleep after eating? Basically, we have a glycemic drop, and then our body tries to turn off the cells that somehow consume more sugar, glucose in the blood, to prevent us precisely from going into a severe hypoglycemia that would obviously lead us into a glycemic coma. How does our body solve this problem? It activates cortisol. That is, cortisol is the hormone that whenever we have a glycemic drop leads with neoglucogenesis by the liver, the spillover of glucose by the liver through glucagon, and then raises the blood sugar again. So whenever we go into hypoglycemia because of a carbohydrate meal, we are stimulating cortisol.
I go back to Dr. Orlando because you, Dr. Orlando, usually says no 50% is done by nutrition, 50% is done by supplementation. In this case, as far as cortisol is concerned, and as far as, so consequently, everything cascades to the various pathologies. How can we balance cortisol through supplementation help, maybe?
Of course, we have a princely supplement, if you will. For example, in Life 120, the Serenity Pro, which is the one that just goes to regulate the level of cortisol in the bloodstream. So that's the supplement that reigns a little bit overall. Then, as we said, vitamin C, vitamin D, because then they are related to an overexpression of cortisol to restore the proper immune system, because cortisol is even used, and this must make us think, as immunosuppressive therapies in patients who are newly transplanted. So this makes us think how much he can lower, almost zero out our immune system if it's used in this way. So the important thing, again, apart from this, the Serenity Pro, vitamin C, vitamin D, so everything we need as a booster to rebalance it. And then I always talk about the antioxidant because it is the one that restores us, rebalances us a little bit, all the intracellular functions.
Thank you, Mr. Orlando. I always see Mr. Panzironi, who has the book Living to 120, The Healings with Him, the book that contains practically all the scientific research that Mr. Panzironi did by going and examining a sample of 1,000 people who were following the Life 120 lifestyle, and then the results that they got because of this lifestyle regarding stress and regarding, of course, cortisol. What kind of results did we get?
So, I want to point out one thing about supplementation, one thing that needs to be said, that a great supplement for reducing cortisol is melatonin. Why is that? Because, of course, melatonin goes to regulate the circadian cycle, and the circadian cycle is a correlation, it's a relationship between daytime cortisol and nighttime melatonin. So if we really want to turn off cortisol at night, we have to take melatonin before we go to sleep. And of course, people who do this Life 120 lifestyle are used to supplementing melatonin to improve sleep, because melatonin is known to improve sleep. But very often the biological function of reducing the stimulation of the adrenal glands is not really explained. And so this switch that is made from cortisol shutting down and melatonin starting, I think is absolutely critical. They are two opposing hormones. So if we have cortisol, they are two antagonists. So if cortisol is high, melatonin doesn't start, and vice versa. If you raise melatonin with an endogenous melatonin, you can partly shut down cortisol production. So it is absolutely critical. We asked everybody a little bit because everybody suffers in some way from a form of insomnia or otherwise has difficulty falling asleep. This we are talking about people who are over 50 years old, because let's remember that most people who follow this lifestyle are people who are from 50 to 100 years old. And so obviously in people up in age, the problem of insomnia or excess cortisol is absolutely a problem that everybody is over 50 years old.
Because there is this reduction in melatonin production by the pineal gland.
In the pineal gland, there is oxidation of the pineal gland on the one hand, and on the other hand, so many decades of overexpression of cortisol undoubtedly lead to its alteration, and therefore all people over the age of 50 easily have a metabolic alteration of the circadian clock, including precisely cortisol and low melatonin. So we asked this group of 1,000 people a question about their sleep quality, which is absolutely critical. And we said, give a grade from 10 to 0. Obviously, 10 is the highest, is 0 at the lowest. And we then asked them to rate before they started doing this lifestyle and then compare the improvement in precisely sleep. The average among these 1,000 people was 4.4, the grade before starting this lifestyle. So we are talking totally insufficient. It even went to 9. That is almost excellent. So it means that people went from a stage of sleep deprivation and insomnia to a stage even almost excellent, as if they were children going back to dreaming.
Are there any other results you can tell us?
There is the quality of life, obviously going from 4 and 9 to 8 and 6. Obviously, it is a bit more general question because it is the one that also basically grants a whole series of improvements, even pathological improvements, because obviously when it is that you live better is when you suffer less. And therefore, by following this lifestyle, there is also a doubling of the perception of the quality of life.
So on this book, Living to 120, The Healings, there is the observational study that obviously confirms the success of the Life 120 lifestyle. So I thank obviously once again our Adriano Panzironi and Dr. Cristian Orlando for being here to make food be your medicine. Adriano Panzironi e il dottor Cristian Orlando per essere stati qui.